Every time a challenger arises, history sends us a warning that great powers don't hand off the reins without a fight. Ever since the end of World War II, the United States has been the global superpower of the world. It has the most advanced military, it's leading the way in innovation with things like AI, biotech, and aerospace, and to this day, the dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. But in the past couple decades, there's been a new world power that's emerged, and in the recent couple of years, they've been challenging the dominance of the United States. The interesting thing though is that this isn't a new story. It's been happening for thousands and thousands of years. It's a cycle called the Thucydides Trap, the scenario in which a rising power threatens the dominance of an established power, leading to an increased likelihood of war. And this trap has been the reason for some of the greatest downfalls in civilization, including classical Athens in 404 BC, the Byzantine Empire in 1453, and Tsarist Russia in 1905. And if the United States isn't careful, then it could be the next world power that gets stuck in this trap. So today I want to go over the concept of a Thucydides trap, where it came from, and most importantly, if the United States is next. But first, we have to go back to ancient Greece to 460 BC. This is where the first ever modern biographer was born. It was a man named Thucydides, and he was born in a time where Athens was the strongest power in the world. Athens was able to defend Greece from an invasion from the Persians, and after that, they sort of flourished as a society. And they continued to flourish until the start of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC. Thucydides was an adult when the war started, and he was made a general who was in charge of a city called Amphipolis. Now, this was a very important role at the time because Amphipolis was an incredibly important city to Athens, kind of a large area, and Thucydides was in charge of a lot here. He was kind of all over the place. So when the Spartans did invade in 424 BC, Thucydides wasn't there. He was actually on a small island called Thasos, and when he heard that the Spartans had invaded, he went as fast as he could, but was too late. The city surrendered very fast, and Thucydides was put into exile by Athens. But the story doesn't end there because Thucydides wasn't done. Now, instead of fighting in the war, he could observe on his own. He was in exile, so he had the opportunity and the liberty of seeing things from both sides. And believe it or not, this is something that almost no one did at the time. Most historians around this time thought of war as a sort of battle of the divine. They wrote about war in the way that we sort of write about superhero movies. They were sort of epics of soldiers and brave men fighting for glory and honor and prestige. War at this time was sort of like a fate determined by the gods, and this is sort of how they saw natural phenomena as well. For an example, you could take how they looked at thunderstorms. They didn't study wind patterns or weather patterns or air density or anything like that. Instead, they came to the conclusion that one of their gods, probably Zeus, was angry at them. During this time, historians saw war as the same thing, but Thucydides took a different approach. He took an extremely analytical stance on war, and this was something that no one had really seen before. He read through the casualty lists and the naval logs. He interviewed the soldiers who were there, the leaders who issued orders, and the citizens on the front lines. And I think the most important thing overall that he did was that he took an objective stance between Athens and Sparta. He was like the first person who stopped seeing war through the lens of myths and legends and gods and started seeing war as a result of human nature, which we all possess. And it was looking at war through this lens that allowed him to come up with one very important sentence. It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. And that leads me to the Thucydides trap. Now, although Thucydides never used the word trap, it was a single sentence that laid the groundwork for what would become this new concept. In the 20th century, the concept actually had a different name. It was called the security dilemma. And it was only fairly recently in 2012 when a guy named Graham Allison published a book. And in this book, he coined the term the Thucydides trap to explain what's going on today. So what is a Thucydides trap? Well, a Thucydides trap is a situation where a rising power threatens the dominance of an already established power. So obviously the two nations in question right now are the United States as the dominant power and China as the rising power. And what Graham Allison did as a historian is that he studied 16 of these examples in recent history and found that 75% of them ended up in some sort of conflict. This means that out of 16 of these Thucydides traps that were found, 12 of them ended up in war. That is not very good. That is a 75% failure rate for peace. And these were only examples studied in recent history, but this pattern has actually been happening for thousands and thousands of years. So before we get into the United States versus China, we got to go over a couple case studies to really understand the mechanics of this trap. Hi, Nick here. So I wanted to take a second and tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Histos. So I've been completely obsessed with biographies for like 2 or 3 years now, and they've probably been the type of book that's influenced my life both in work and relationships the most. And so I made Histos to share that experience with you guys. Histos is a podcast that gives you every day a 5-minute episode that covers one great person from history and one concept that you can actually apply that very day. It covers people like Steve Jobs, Cleopatra, Walt Disney, Napoleon, some of the greats from history, and it's every single day, so you get something new to work on in your own life that very same day. So it's a podcast that's actually meant to improve your life because it gives you something to work on. The link will be in the description if you want to go check it out, and you'll be supporting the channel as well. So thank you very much for the people who do that. Now back to the video. The first ever recorded Thucydides Trap is of course the one with Thucydides himself, the one that he witnessed, with Athens being the dominant power and Sparta being the rising power. This case study starts off in 480 BC when Athens successfully defended an attack from Persia from the east. After this attack, Athens knew that they needed to get a bunch of groups in Greece together to form a defense pact. So they got together with all these people and they decided to make a defense league called the Delian League. And this was a bunch of very small nations coming together and saying, we're all going to help each other defend each other from future threats. The deal was this: if you're part of the Delian League, you must contribute either ships or money to a treasury, which was really just to Athens, who would oversee the defense of Aegean. This pact made Athens extremely rich and gave them the most powerful navy in the world. And from there on, it was smooth sailings for Athens. They had naval superiority over everyone else. And I mean, it was naval superiority. No one was even close. They had hundreds and hundreds of triremes patrolling trade routes and all sorts of things over the seas. Also, check out these triremes. They are crazy awesome and fairly new at the time. Pretty soon, this Delian League, this coalition of nations, turned into the Athenian Empire. Also, this should be reminding you of someone. A group of nations coming together, forming a defense pact to protect the world against communism. I mean, defense, whatever. The point is, it should remind you a little bit of NATO, with the United States right at the top, leading a group of nations and having naval superiority over the rest of the world. But just south of Athens, there was another power, and they were also on the rise, just a little bit behind, and they also had their own league called the Peloponnesian League, and Sparta was the largest power within it. But the thing about Sparta, though, is that they were mostly only powerful on land due to their famous phalanx formation, which just dominated land completely. Sparta, seeing that Athens was developing their navy, also began to develop their navies until the end of the war. At first, it started off with just strengthening alliances and economic fights, but pretty soon, it turned into the Peloponnesian War between Athens and the Delian League and Sparta and the Peloponnesian League. To give a very quick summary of the actual war, Athens started out winning just because of how powerful their navy was, but as the war went on and as Sparta continued to get more money from Persia, they actually developed their navy way faster than Athens and was able to supersede them in a final battle. This final battle was actually a naval battle. It was called Aegospotami. I don't know how to say that, but the point is that during this battle, the Spartans destroyed almost the entirety of Athens' fleet, a combined total of 180 ships. After this, they were able to blockade Athens and then laid siege to the city, which ended the war in 404 BC. Now, this next thing is very important. This single year marked the end of the Athenian Empire and made Sparta the new strongest power in all of Greece. So let's do a quick recap of this war from the perspective of a Thucydides trap. First of all, you have a rising dominant power. So in this case, it was the Athenian Empire dominating the sea. Second, you have a rising challenger who offers a response out of fear. So Sparta begins to get foreign aid from Persia and starts building up their own fleet. Then there's a slow escalation. These are small skirmishes, small clashes at sea, and the strengthening of allies, which quickly leads to a full-out war, which was the Peloponnesian War. And all of this combined leads to a new dominant power, which was Sparta dominating all of Greece. This 5-step pattern sort of encapsulates the whole philosophy of a Thucydides trap. It's a rise followed by fear, followed by escalation, followed by war, followed by a power shift. So before we get into how this applies to the United States versus China, let's go over one more case study that's a bit more recent. This one takes place in the early 20th century, and it's the Russo-Japanese War between Russia and Japan. In this case, the dominant power in East Asia was Russia, with Japan as the new rising power. You see, by the early 1900s, Russia was investing into all sorts of new things. They were taking land in Eastern Europe, they were modernizing its military, they were building up its infrastructure with things like the Trans-Siberian Railway, and this railway would actually be very important because the Russian Empire was huge. They have so much land to cover, but because of this, they had a lot of organization issues. Japan at this time was also going through a change, specifically the Meiji Restoration after 1868. Japan began building steel mills, railways, a cutting-edge navy, and the most important one was they started looking for more land. Once again, the escalation between these two nations started very slowly, mostly over these two pieces of land, Manchuria and Korea. And just like the Peloponnesian War, both of of these nations started immediately building up their navy. Russia was importing ships from Europe and fortifying important ports like Port Arthur, and in 1902, Japan secured the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which guaranteed British support in case of war. Russia tried to do the same with France and Germany, but found little success there. These defensive pacts were actually the last straw, as both countries could see that they were preparing for war, and eventually one of them attacked. In February of 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur, actually quite similar to the Pearl Harbor attack, and after that attack, the Russo-Japanese War began. This war didn't last nearly as long as the Peloponnesian War. There was a couple skirmishes, but Japan very quickly secured a victory at the Battle of Tsushima. At this final battle, the Japanese fleet intercepted the Russian fleet and completely destroyed 38 of 40 enemy ships in just hours. In large part, the outcome of this war was sort of decided from the beginning. Russia had many logistical problems, many organization problems, and was at a time of political instability as well. While Japan, on the other hand, had an extremely strong navy, and at that final battle, their navy proved to be much better than Russia's. Whatever the case is, Russia lost, and this war ended up in the Russian Revolution of 1905, and ended up in the Japanese Empire, which would lead to the culmination of what happened during World War II. So let's do another quick recap of the Russo-Japanese War from a Thucydides Trap perspective. First, you have the rise. In this case, Japan rose up by building its navy after the Meiji Revolution. Second is fear. Russia's alarm began sounding over the Japanese buildup and challenging of their presence in the Pacific. Third is escalation. Both of these nations started building up their navy and looking for alliances as the fear began to grow. 4 is war, which began after the Japanese surprise attack on Port Arthur. And number 5 is the balance shifts in the Pacific with a rising Japanese empire. So why do Thucydides traps happen? Why does this pattern repeat over and over again for countless times throughout history? Well, first let's go over the psychology of the rise and fall of a nation, and you can use this psychology to define a nation, a person, or even a business. At first, a nation starts at the bottom. It's not that powerful yet, but it's new and it's figuring things out. Eventually, they start to figuring things out, not in a linear way, but in an exponential way. The people of the nation begin to work extremely hard. They take the best parts of other nations and they allocate their resources in the right way to build a stronger nation. Usually, this means spending lots of money on education. When the nation reaches the top, they now have the most resources, a strong military, and a united culture. This is the era of peace and prosperity. But there's a saying that goes, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Eventually, a nation loses its hunger to stay on top. Smaller nations begin to work harder, and pretty soon, just as fast as a nation was able to rise to the top, it once again falls to the bottom. Already you can see how the Thucydides traps plays into this, but what we haven't talked about yet is a term that's very important when it comes to the psychology of nations, and that term is zero-sum thinking. Zero-sum thinking is the belief that one side's gain is inherently another side's lost. So you can think of two siblings sharing a single pie. If one sibling decides to take a larger slice, then there is automatically a smaller slice for the other sibling and conflict arises. Except when it comes to nation, we're not talking about pie. We're talking about land, natural resources, and technology. When Athens started ramping up their navy, Sparta knew that their place in the world was going to be challenged, and this created a sense of fear. This fear is what drives the Thucydides trap. If you fear you're going to lose something, then you're going to fight hard for what you think you're about to lose. So what are some ways that a nation could possibly take more of the slice of the pie? The first is, of course, land. Since the earth is filled with a finite amount of land, nations will always be looking to expand their borders and gain more land. The second is natural resources. Once again, natural resources are finite and valuable as well. Take oil, for example. You can imagine that a nation is very rich off of selling oil, and suddenly, if another nation discovers a huge amount of oil on their land, the previous nation's oil is going to be devalued because the supply of oil in the market goes up. Suddenly, you fear losing market dominance, and this could lead to a Thucydides trap. And probably the most important way that you could take a larger piece of the pie is military power and technology, because that is what leads me to the United States versus China. So finally, is the United States and China in a Thucydides trap or not? Well, here are a couple parallels for why that might be the case. Parallel 1, China's GDP and economic rise and trade wars. Let's start with this very important chart. This is the global trade dominance with China all the way in the year 2000. This was around 10 years after China opened themselves up to global trade. And this is the global trade dominance now. As you can see, there's clearly been a Chinese takeover when it comes to global trade dominance. This is in large part due to the fact that China is able to provide very cheap labor, and so a lot of countries are willing to pay China to make stuff for them. And the United States also does this. A lot of businesses in the States import stuff from China simply because it's cheaper to make something in China than it is in the United States. This has allowed China to build stronger and stronger relationships with many other countries, and has allowed them to invest in many countries, strengthening their alliances. Parallel 2, China's tech and military modernization. Another thing that you see is that China is improving their military very, very fast. In 2024, China's defense budget rose year on year by 7.2%, roughly 1.78 trillion yuans. They now have the largest navy in the world, although that's very arguably in terms of quantity and not in quality. Their boats suck. Anyway, China now has 2,000 ballistic and cruise missile launchers, which shows a massive leap from just a couple of decades ago. And in the age of computing, China hosts 246 of the world's top 500 supercomputers, which will allow it to build faster models in AI, climate modeling, and defense simulations. So overall, what you can say about China's military is that they are modernizing extremely fast, and there's obviously a lot of fear in the United States that they might catch up. Parallel 3, Taiwan tensions, South China Sea. And finally, we have land, and this is most likely where the war would start. This is where all the focus is at the moment. According to China, this small little island called Taiwan is part of China, and this part of the ocean, which the world believes to be international waters, to China is also part of China. And China wants the world to know this. Recently, China has been harassing fishermen in these seas, making sure the world knows what they think. Not just this, but they've also been flying their military planes over Taiwanese airspace. The United States, who gets almost all of their microchips from Taiwan, has talked about sticking up for Taiwan in case of a Chinese invasion. And this would be the start of a war that no one is ready for. So all in all, the pattern is right there. You have a world-dominating power who for a good time now has lived in peace and prosperity, but now you have a rising power, someone to challenge that dominance. And that rising power not only plans to take the reserve currency of the world, but they are building stronger and stronger alliances and building a way more powerful military, and pretty soon might just begin to take more land because they believe that it is their right. So to me, the question isn't whether the United States and China is in a Thucydides trap, because it's very, very clear that they are, but the question is there any way to avoid war? And the truth is, I don't know. It's very hard for me to believe that human nature won't just repeat over and over and over again, but at the same time, the optimistic side of me hopes that both of these nations will realize that World War III might be a war that no one will survive. And so that's the final point that we're left on. Is the Thucydides trap going to keep repeating over and over again, or can we find a way to live in peace? And I definitely want to know your predictions and what you all think in the comments, so definitely leave a comment. That is all I have for you today. If you want daily doses of historical wisdom, check out Histos in the link in the description, and that's it. See ya.